Welcome everyone to today's digital lunch talk, Visions of a New European Peace Order in the context of ZOiS thematic focus, 30 post-Soviet years. My name is Nadia Douglas. I'm a researcher at ZOiS, the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin. And today's webinar is organized in cooperation with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation's Regional Office for Cooperation and Peace in Europe. And my special thanks go to the colleagues in Vienna who actively contributed to the planning and organization of the event today. Our discussion today will be dedicated to the historic dimension of those crucial years between 1989 and 1991 that proved to be such a turning point for peace and stability in Europe. We will try to take a retrospective look at developments following the special summit of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, and later evolving into the OSCE in Paris in November 1990. This historic event was preceded by Germany's reunification process, followed then by the end of the Warsaw Pact in March 1991, and then the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union. Despite the historic dimension at the time, there was, what I noticed, only limited attention last year given to the 30th anniversary of the Paris Charter for New Europe and the historical narratives that were actually related to that about the birth of a new European peace order. And what was remarkable about it was that the fact that the civil society perspective and component was completely missing from these retrospectives. I would like to briefly recall how ambitious civic movements at the time were. When we look at the founding document, for example, of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly of October 1990, it could be read there that the joint goal was to overcome the division of Europe, and that this was a job, especially of civil society, of citizens acting together in self-organization across national boundaries. The Helsinki process from above was meant to be complemented by an equally significant Helsinki process from below. And following the events of 1990, 1991, the Helsinki Citizens Assembly was still very active, organizing big conferences and focusing also on the unfolding conflicts in former Yugoslavia and around Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan at the time. However, already in the late 90s, it lost its importance and the international network also ceased to exist. What we are left today with is the Civic Solidarity Platform of the OSCE, where I believe the Hungarian Helsinki Committee and the Moscow Helsinki Group are also both members. However, this advocacy network, which sort of covers the entire OSCE region, it is much less political in the sense that it does not focus so much anymore on questions of security, peace, disarmament. And our aim today is to find out what happened afterwards that made us get into the situation we're in today in terms of East-West relations, where we can at best speak of a situation of peaceful coexistence. A situation, in addition, that is accompanied by shrinking spaces for civil societies at the domestic levels and the absence of a meaningful transnational dialogue. So before I get started, or we get started, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that there will be a follow-up lunch talk organized by ZOiS and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in June. I will give some more details about it later. Without further ado, I want to now present to you the participants of today's discussion. We have first Marta Badawi. She is co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. The Hungarian Helsinki Committee was founded in 1989 to monitor the first free elections and the democratization processes in Hungary. Marta holds a law degree from the ELTE Faculty of Law in Budapest. She has experience not only in the defense of human rights and the rule of law, but also in the protection of refugees. Currently, she is a policy leader fellow at the European University Institute's School of Transnational Governance in Florence. Then we have Rafael Biaman. He is a professor and chair of international relations at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. He is a political scientist and he wrote his PhD on the very pertinent topic of German reunification and the Soviet position at the time. His research focuses on security governance in Europe, cooperation and conflict within international organizations, prevention and mediation of conflicts with a regional emphasis on Southeastern Europe, the Caucasus, and the transatlantic dimension. And last but not least, we have Dimitri Makaf from Moscow. He is a member of the Council of the Moscow Helsinki Group. That is the oldest human rights organization in Russia, founded in 1976 to monitor state compliance with the Helsinki Final Act of the CCE, today's OSCE. Dimitri holds a law degree from Ariel State University. He has plenty of experience working as a human rights trainer and has been engaged in various human rights monitoring missions in the past. So I would suggest we begin with Marta and then Dimitri, because both of you have worked closely with the respective founders of your organizations, that is the former dissidents Ferenc Köcsök in Hungary and Ludmila Alexeyeva and others in Moscow. So my question to you would be, what did you learn from them about these crucial years between 1989 and 1991 and the role of civic society in the international context at the time? Marta, you just left for a second. I don't know if you listened to the question.
Yes, hello, and I apologize for the faulty internet connection. So could you please repeat it?
So my question was that you worked closely with Ferenc Köcsök, who was the founder of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. And my question to you was, what did you learn from him about these crucial years and the role that civic society played not only in Hungary, but also in the international context at the time? Maybe you start and then we have Dimitri.
Yes, there seems to be a lag in the connection that I have here, so I apologize for that. Could you please repeat the question again, Nadia?
The question was, you work closely with the founder or the founders of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. So what did you learn from Ferenc Köcsök, for example, and about those years and about the role of civil society in the international context during that time?
Yes, I've been working at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee for a good number of years together with Ferenc Köcsök, one of the founders and still the honorary chairperson of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, at a time when the Hungarian Helsinki Committee was just starting off as an organization with a proper office and staff, until 2007, when he retired. And over that time, of course, there's been a very successful growth of the organization and a sphere shift in the landscape. But I think one thing that remained the same was that this persistence of spirit, and also the belief that facts and the exposing of facts themselves is extremely important to be credible in calling for better protection for human rights and better systems and structures. So I think for Ferenc, it's been always very much a focus on the individual rights violations, stories of clients who are either refugees or people who had been ill-treated by the police, and using a collection of these stories documented in the most professional way, and also using legal tools to show systemic problems. So going from the individual to the systematic, I think, was extremely important. And this method is something that survives through decades. And in our toolbox of working methods, helping individuals, providing free of charge legal assistance in very important cases that can shed light on systemic and systematic violations of human rights has remained very important. And in this endeavor, the international cooperation has always been extremely important, be it with other civil society organizations across borders, neighboring Hungary on the refugee protection field. This is very obvious that you need international partners to assist your clients. But also now, 30 years onward, I think we see how on many other issues that that plague democracy and rule of law protection in Europe today, this cooperation is still very important. But the methods and the types of tools used have shifted immensely. And I think back in the very early 90s, the personal contacts mattered a lot. And we're now back after a big detour, seeing how personal contacts and networks of people knowing each other, knowing each other's work, and the context that that human rights activists and human rights defending organizations must work in, knowing this on a personal level has always been extremely essential. And I think this was missing for a long time, but certainly in the beginning of the 90s, this was still very much alive. You knew who was doing what at a time that was before the internet. So connections were far more difficult, technically speaking, but somehow easier on a personal level. The substance of these connections was also more comprehensive. A few years later on, when I joined the Hungarian Helsinki Committee as a very young law student, the focus shifted to institutions and institutions, human rights, working on the human rights protection framework, and quite with a more specific narrow focus and lens. But I think still around 89 and 90 and 91, the dimension, the human rights and the human dimension as the OSCE understands it, was still very much a part of the vocabulary, a part of the conceptual framework. How democracy is going to help bring about not only personal fulfillment and full protection of human rights, but also freedom and peace. And over time, as this lens shifted to other institutions and more specific, a more specific human rights dictionary and catalog, the frame and the lens also narrowed down. And I think for quite a while, maybe it's still with us today, this narrow lens has remained. So the spectrum of issues that brought people together, I think, became narrower. And this is why we could see in the case of Hungary, which obviously is what I know best, already in the mid-90s, with bloody wars and turbulent conflicts just a couple of 100 kilometers south of Hungary, how civil society, those organizations and individuals focused on human rights protection, look towards the Council of Europe and also maybe already towards the EU, and not necessarily on what is happening right next door. And so what you talked about, Nadia, in your introductory statement about the division of Europe and the hope that these divisions would be overcome by citizens working together, I'm not sure that was really fulfilled. It's still a very important mission, a hope, but but I'm not sure that the 90s delivered this in the wider region. For some countries, for some groups, yes, but not for Europe widely understood. And I think that was looking back, that was one change I would have probably been happy to see. Another shift that I saw in the 90s was also from the personal to the institutional. So the personal links between human rights defenders, dissidents, maybe faded. A new generation of activists was certainly emerging, and the focus became very technical, extremely important for the enforcement of human rights and for remedying human rights violations. But it was less on forging long-standing ties between people. And towards the national constituencies in the countries that these organizations were working. So certainly the wish and the efforts to strengthen democratic institutions did not translate into strengthening democracy and raising democratic, not only awareness, but enthusiasm and appreciation for it by the citizens. And human rights organizations do have a role. We see how that role has become ever more present. There is, I think, a return to this idea, thankfully, in the past maybe 10 years. But in the 90s, at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, our focus was on using the law and the newly building up legal framework and not necessarily addressing citizens directly. And that you cannot obviously have a democracy without democratic institutions, but you can't have it either without people who appreciate it and understand what it means in everyday practice. There was I think, a missed focus on this area. But of course, it was a complicated time, and with extremely rapid progress, which now in the 21st century we're not seeing. So I just know everybody was extremely busy building and using new tools. So the focus was on important things, but it wasn't maybe as comprehensive as it should have been.
Okay, thank you very much, Marta. We have to move now to Dimitri. I think you made a very interesting point in saying that the 90s didn't really deliver in terms of those new value systems, especially they did not deliver for the wider Europe. Wider Europe also involving or including Russia. That was very important at the time. So my question to Dimitri, so what did you inherit from your predecessors in terms of historical narratives and experience?
Yeah, thanks a lot for a chance to speak. And a lot of ideas that I had actually resonate with what Marta has been saying. And one of the lessons that I learned from Lyudmila Alexeyeva was her persistent optimism. She kind of compared to the period in which Moscow Helsinki Group and the Helsinki movement started. She was constantly optimistic about the period in which we live and in which we fight. She said that in order to see changes in Russia, you have to live a long life. So, I remember her together with Yuri Orlov in Kiev in 2007, right after the International Helsinki Federation broke down. And then we discussed also the future of the Helsinki movement. And it seemed that the amount of respect that they were met with from their fellow Ukrainian dissident counterparts or from dissident human rights defenders from Belarus was enormous and unparalleled. And I think that connection, that kind of international connection of that Soviet dissident movement is in many ways lost now. And then we talk about the 90s. We also have to mention that there was a sort of a lot of fragmentation on the part of the civil society. I mean, even back in 2007, long before the war of Ukraine has started, you already could see that the connection was shared with all the dissident movement, but it's no longer shared with the ones that come afterwards. For them, we were the Russian human rights defenders. For us, our Ukrainian colleagues in many ways were Ukrainian human rights defenders. There was not a sense of a common movement. And that sense of a common movement we are lacking in all the other attempts to reconstruct some sort of civil society initiative. And Civic Solidarity Platform is a good example of this. Very much focused on not building a common movement, but rather finding a way to balance interest of different national groups. And I do feel that there is a sort of loss of a sense of a mission and much more focus on national agendas, on donor-driven agendas, and on international organizations. And that's where the ambition gets lost, because you don't have a vision that you propose. And I think now the troubled times that we have, with the war going on in the middle of Europe, in Ukraine, the conflict going on between society and the authorities in Belarus, the current human rights crisis in Russia, and also not even mentioning the things that are going on in Poland or in Hungary, we once more have larger issues on the agenda. And once more, we have to answer, what is Europe? Is Russia part of Europe? Is Ukraine, Belarus part of Europe? And I'm not talking about European Union, which kind of hijacked the notion of Europe in many minds, but I'm talking about a wider Europe, the one that was going to be born out of the breakdown of the Berlin Wall, the one that the Helsinki Citizens Assembly in many ways envisioned as a Europe of citizens, not a Europe of nations. I mean, that's issues that we are struggling with at the moment. And human rights movement in many ways has been very responsive to different crises, but not very proactive in drawing an agenda. I mean, I dare to say that for Soviet dissidents, that persistent optimism was counterintuitive, because they didn't expect to win. They expected to be imprisoned, and they didn't expect to get support from the Western counterparts either way. Also, if you read the memoirs of Yuri Orlov, he's very clear about that. He said he never had any illusions that the Western diplomats or a wider Western public was interested in human rights in the Soviet Union, other than a way to ensure security. But it doesn't mean that we cannot use that rhetoric, we cannot use those tools to promote our agenda. And our agenda, in his mind, was the human dimension of security, human rights and rule of law, and freedom, more freedom in a more democratic society. So in that sense, we are, as a movement, in many ways, I dare to say, fell victim to our own success. We have won and became complacent in that victory, because the history did not end in '89, did not end in the '90s. And we see very much that all those patterns are returning now. And I guess that's also one of the lessons that we can learn from our predecessors, but also something that we can diverge from them. Because I don't think that the similar expectations that some of the dissident circles have shared with the collective West, or with Europe or the US, are no longer there in the new generation. I think Ukraine is learning that a hard way. Belarus is learning that a hard way. With Russia, it's much more complicated because it tries to position itself as autonomous and not needing any of those connections. And in that sense, we need to retain them. But those dilemmas are still there with us.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, for your insights. And I would now like to take in the opinion of Professor Biaman. In a recent contribution to the historical yearbook, you took a pretty skeptical look back to these ceremonial proclamations of a new peace order during those watershed years. Why was this whole concept so fragile from the outset? And what were the decisive factors or developments that this value-based consensus could not really be sustainable in the long run? And finally, the question, why, despite all these declarations, were demands by civil society, as Dimitri just put it, to promote a human agenda of security? Why was this so little considered by political leaders during those following years?
Yes, thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you for being able to join you, both of you, or all three. Thanks to Dimitri and Marta for your comments. They sound quite pessimistic and a little bit frustrated about the vector of human rights developments, but also of transnational civil society movements since the 1990s. And I can very much understand that, although I'm not a specialist of civil society organizations. From my point of view, there was I would say that the time when the Helsinki groups were founded in '76 following, this was a time that was quite similar to today. It was very frustrating. It needed persistence. There was not much hope at the time that there would be real change. And those who took up the burden to fight for human rights, now being backed by the Helsinki Charter at the time, which had very clear language about minority rights and human rights in it in '75, those had a real hard time. And there was very little perspective of hope at the time. Still, they were fighting. And then came the 80s, and then came Gorbachev, and I think it started really with this kind of new thinking in Gorbachev's foreign policy and with perestroika and glasnost, that there was this kind of change, this wind of change, as the American president at the time, George Bush, formulated it. And this wind was taking up breath, if you want so, in the late 80s, and that was the time when the civil society organizations obviously realized there is a chance of change. There is hope. There is really a momentum gaining speed, and obviously the change in the Soviet Union propelled the change in the other countries at the time. So it was kind of a top-down movement first, initiated by Gorbachev and the reformers. But then I think it was very much taken up. Was taken up by civil society organizations in Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, in Soviet Union overall. And I think there was this kind of feeling that there is a change is possible in the late 80s, in '89 especially, in early '89, or let's say late '88, with the changes first in Hungary and then in Poland with the first democratic elections there in May '89. So before the GDR began to topple, the events in Hungary and in Poland really stirred up hope, and the civil society organizations, they really moved into the center of politics, of both national and international politics at the time. So Charter 77, Solidarność, and also even the civil society, the small civil society groups in Germany, in Eastern Germany, even in Romania and Bulgaria, they became important at the time. So this was, I think, the change after it was taken up, the civil society organizations took up the momentum from Gorbachev and demanded much more. And at that point of time, there was this real hope that things would change, that On the one hand, a new European order, a common European house, as Gorbachev said, could be built without the German wall, uniting East and West, a new Central Europe, as was an important term that was circulating, especially, for example, in Czechoslovakia at the time. And so much of the change was initiated, I think, in this time by civil society organizations. And actually, the governments, they were the ones who were trying to keep control, and they had lost control in the beginning of 1989. I would say almost all over 89, ending with the fall of the wall, with the refugees in the GDR refugees fleeing to Warsaw, to Prague, and to Eastern Berlin, and then across the border of Hungary, with the huge demonstrations in all the countries. There was really this kind of bottom-up movement, and I think the civil society organizations, they deserve credit for instigating the change that took place in '89. But I would say already in late '89, governments took over control again of the movement and of the developments. Latest after the toppling of the Berlin Wall. One reason surely was that some of the major figures of the civil society movements like Václav Havel and Lech Walesa, they took over government positions. So they moved into government at the time. So they could realize what they dreamed of before. Yeah, but they were no more opposition. They lost their counterparts, if you want so. They lost much of the vision, if you want so, what Dimitri said, much of the vision at the time already, I would say. Yeah. Now they were confronted with power politics in government, a totally different situation. Before they could just follow their vision, now they had to realize the vision. That was much more difficult, to be in government and to construct a new society. And this was inward looking, of course, also because they were looking mainly for themselves and for their country, and not so much linking anymore with the other countries and the movements, because that was not necessary at least in Poland and Hungary at the time, not anymore. In the Soviet Union, it also seemed not to be necessary as long as Gorbachev was there. Only after Gorbachev this changed. So I think this was a transformative moment. I think it was a watershed for civil society organizations because they had to reinvent themselves. They had to find a new mission, a new purpose. Because human rights was not anymore the big topic, at least not in Poland. It was still a big topic in Romania and in Bulgaria. And it became a real topic again in Russia and also in Hungary today, but not in between. So they had to reinvent themselves. So this is my view on civil society organizations. Now, as concerns the overall European vector, I think the idea of the common European house, or what Dimitri called the wider Europe idea, I think this was a legitimate and realistic idea at the time, and there was real reason for hope at the time. If you look at November 1990, the Paris Charter, I think the most important thing was that the Paris Charter and the CSE Human Dimension, as it was called, 3 conferences at the time in 1990 and 1991, they really represented a new spirit in Europe, if you want so, a norm convergence. We were believing in the same norms at the time, if you want so, values. Yeah, so the main human and minority rights that were propagated before but not realized in the Eastern Bloc, they were shared in the West and in the East. So there was some kind of common values, at least in the Gorbachev years. Now these common values still were fragile. Why? Because within the Soviet Union there was Gorbachev and his reformers. And they were talking not about Western values or about human rights. They used another terminology, but they meant the same thing. Yeah. But the problem was that the reformers within Russia, they had a very strong opposition, and that opposition was marginalized by Gorbachev at the time. And Gorbachev centralized his decision-making and used informal circles in order to push through his ideas against the nomenclatura of the time. And those like Ligachev, who just died, they had totally different opinions within the Politburo, within the Central Committee. And so once Gorbachev was gone, the old forces came back and they had their old ideas, and they were frustrated, deeply frustrated about the loss of Western Europe, about the loss of the satellite system, about the loss of the Soviet Union. And this identity crisis within the Soviet Union, or then in Russia, I think contributed a lot to the autocratic turn that we have today in Russia. An identity crisis, the loss of empire. Yeah, how do you deal with that? The deep economic crisis in which Russia plunged at the time. And then came the big open question, what to do with the European security system. And I think on this point, there was a lot of solemn declarations, including the Paris Charter, but the reality was much more down to earth. The governments, as I said, were in control again, and the governments, despite the rhetorics of a common European house, they had very divergent ideas of how to realize that house. And the major difference was that the one party, and that was especially the USA, but also Germany and France and Great Britain, especially under Thatcher, said, hey, we want to keep our NATO. NATO is a pillar of our security system. It has carried us well through the last 40 years. Why should we give this up for a European security system that is very nebulous at the time? And they had only 1 year, and that was the year of German unification, because the decision about NATO persistence or a new European house was taken during the 2+4 negotiations. There was just 1 year. In October 1990, it was decided that NATO would remain because the GDR would shift into NATO. So it was the first Eastern enlargement of NATO when the GDR joined NATO and also the European Union. And the ideas by Gorbachev and his team of creating a new European house, that was the other party, of creating something completely new from scratch, did not really resonate well in the West. I think, and I think it didn't resonate well in some parts of Central Europe or Central Eastern Europe as well. Yeah, there was still the Warsaw Pact. Okay, the Warsaw Pact would go, that was clear. There was no chance to keep it. But so the Western countries were saying, well, we are winning the Cold War, especially in the USA. We are winning the Cold War. Why should we give up that instrument that secured the victory in the Cold War, which is NATO? So if you look at the time of the Paris Charter in November 1990, you see this is extremely fragile. In Russia, already one month afterwards, Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, resigned. 1 month afterwards. Why? Because there was so much resistance against his course in Central and Eastern Europe. He just couldn't bear it. 2 months later, there was this intervention, military intervention of the Soviet troops in the Baltics. The bloody days in Lithuania and in Vilnius and in Latvia. And then came the Orbis putsch coup against Gorbachev next year. So this was a very fragile situation. And don't forget that already at the time of the Paris Charter, the same month, I think 1 or 2 months later, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. Yeah, and of course the Baltic states were invited to that summit by the French, and they couldn't be on the stage because the Soviets said, if they are on the stage, we will leave. Yeah, so you see there were many rivalries and problems and power struggles even at the summit, and the idea of a glorious new European and world order vanished very soon, and I think the fragility already was visible for those who wanted to see the fractures within this seemingly or apparently very homogeneous value block East and West at the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Biaman, for delineating all these historical developments for us. I just want to encourage now also people, audience watching us. If you want, you can also post questions on the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that and reserve some time for answering questions in the end. Now, I just wanted to also state there was this time, 1990 to 92, was important also in setting the cornerstones for the European security system, also in terms of the European arms control treaties regarding military transparency. So there was the CFE treaty, the Vienna document. Most of these treaties today are outdated. But already at the time, also civil society did not really have a voice in these processes anymore. And it was all decided on the level of high politics. So my question to all three of you would be now, what are the reasons why we are back now today in this form of old thinking in terms of zero-sum games instead of cooperation, joint endeavors? And from the perspective of civil society and human rights defense, why is the return to domestic issues so predominant today? You, in part, you already answered that, but maybe you can just give a very short comment each on that, maybe 1-2 minutes maximum, because so we have some time left. Who wants to start? Okay.
So I found these comments very fascinating. Thank you both for them. Some of the ideas or the questions that you raised could be, absolutely spot on for 2021 too, and I think that says quite a lot. Rafael Biaman talked about how civil society had to reinvent itself and find a new role for itself, as it had been shifted out of the center of politics. And I think this is a very important question. Certainly, from the Hungarian example, I see how civil society organizations really don't want to become involved in not party, but political issues. And this is partly a result of the ongoing intimidation and the pushing out from the public discourse of voices which are critical, but also because there's been, probably in a justified way, disappointment with the political parties. And so cooperation and the willingness to engage is really low. Civil society organizations want to stay away, but this also means giving up ground on advocacy, on making suggestions, on holding government accountable. And so I see a lot of space for cooperation on this. And in fact, I am working now on a project which is focusing on 13 EU member states. And that's true, that's a geographic limitation or constraint that comes out of a common existing, very strong common framework, where we want to work together to be better at advocating for strong rule of law and human rights and civic space within the EU, something that 10 years ago would not have been an issue, but today it's very much so. And so transnational networking and cooperation among civil society organizations is essential for that. But this reinvention of the mission and the role also has to come with reinventing the way these organizations engage, both towards the decision makers, those that, as Nadia, you talked about this now, how decisions were all of a sudden made far above the heads of civil society, of citizens. We have to re-engage, we have to demand that engagement again and become better, but also the other way around for citizens too. So it's really important to understand what this disillusionment in many places with democracy means on a personal level, why people don't think that this is the best way forward. and how we can be better at talking to our own societies, our neighbors, when it comes to human rights and rule of law, which are fundamental. And this reinvention, I think, is taking place, but it's a very slow learning process. And in the meantime, we see how the unorganized civil society is growing, and it's becoming stronger in many parts of Europe. It's extremely strong in some parts, and in Central Europe, there's also a lot. So it is a shifting landscape, I think, with a shifting role, more diversifying role. But it's both a focus on the national and the local, but I think with I would advocate for refocusing also on the transnational, because the issues apparently are very common. And I find it worryingly similar, at least the alarm bells should be ringing the same way everywhere.
Okay, thank you, Marta. And now, Dimitri, very short comments, because I just heard that we have already questions in the chat. And for everyone listening to us, the chat is now not disabled anymore. You can ask your questions.
Yeah, I will try to be concise, although it's a very complicated question. And sometimes it also makes me doubt whether the civil society was ever at the center of politics, because in a way it did have an impact, but the politics were done behind closed doors, as also Professor Biaman has shown in his intervention. But at the same time, I remain a strong believer in the impact of citizen-driven change. And I think we are in a much better place now, ironically, for that citizen-driven change. And I think it is time to realign, to reassign, and not to be so nostalgic about the loss of NGO power, because civil society is not the same as NGOs. And I think it's going to have an impact, and more people are being engaged in political discussions, in political movements now. And I think I remain an optimist in that sense.
Right. Professor Biaman?
I'm not sure about loss of NGO power. I think we have a divide between East and West. I think this time when the NGOs in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 flourished, and I think when they with their agenda, or they were setting the agenda at the time for high politics, I would say, but only in this very short window of maybe a year. In some countries, like in Poland, maybe already in '88, also in Hungary, but in some countries never, like in Romania, and in Bulgaria even. So it's different. But in Western Europe, I would say there is not a loss of NGO power, but I would say an increase of NGO power. If I'm not a specialist of civil society organization studies, but what I see is, for example, if I look at the European Union, there was never more input by civil society organizations into decision-making of European institutions than today, I would say. Or take the Council of Europe. One of my colleagues worked there, and he said there is really a lot of consultation today with NGOs trying to influence the agenda within the Council of Europe. Or take what we call transnational advocacy groups. So NGOs link very much today, I think, at least in Western countries, in order to push their agenda, because they know they can't do it on a local or on a national level. So they link up and push the agenda, for example, concerning anti-personnel mines. And this is indeed security or disarmament. So even in disarmament, what is the center of high politics traditionally, they have become a voice, and I think a strong voice in campaigns in order to outlaw also, for example, nuclear weapons. Yeah, so I think there is a change going on, but it's a slow change. And my concern is more, is the consultation of civil society organizations, is it just a facade for the governments, or is it real? Do they really listen? And from my study, sometimes I have my doubts and I can't really say. And since I have worked for many years in the government myself, I know that there is a strong neglect of governments of civil society organizations by governments. Yeah, also because they have really a very high-speed agenda. They have very little time to listen. But still, I think there is the exchange of views between government and civil society organizations still has much room for improvement. Yeah, but you also talked about the European agenda, and you said, why are we back to high politics, and why are we back, if you want so, to a situation where we are back into confrontation in Europe? This is another level of analysis, if you want so. I think it's too much for this meeting now to talk about that. It has many different reasons. What I wanted to highlight is, I think that many reasons date back to the early 90s. It's not all NATO enlargement. It's not all EU enlargement. It's not all NATO-Russia confrontation or whatever. It dates back to the early times of the post-Cold War time, of the post-Cold War years, and the decisions that were taken at the time, which might be lost opportunities or missed opportunities at the time.
Thank you very much, Professor Biaman. I think missed opportunities is a very good keyword. I was told the chat doesn't entirely work, so therefore we decided to unmute participants wanting to ask a question directly. And we have a question of Reinhard Krumm from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, who is now unmuted. Please.
Thank you very much, Nadia, and thank you very much for a very inspiring discussion. I have a question maybe to Dimitri, because I thought your remarks were going beyond the usual what one hears, especially coming from Russia. And it's a question concerning peace in Europe. The European security is not in a good shape. Needless to say that, and we don't have to elaborate on that. I think it's clear. In the 80s and 90s, usually the Helsinki groups concentrated on the third basket for good reasons. And my question is that still good enough? In other words, do you have to expand? Peace is more complex. Civil society can do quite a bit, and Rafael Biaman was pointing out the increasing influence, but not in all countries. So in other words, the challenge we have with European security shouldn't that also be a concern for Helsinki groups? Or should there be new groups? Why should be Helsinki groups only seen as being started in the past? Why not coming up with new to raise that voice on that matter? Thank you.
I actually agree. I do think it's an issue for civil society to address, and it's an issue that the governments are even more reluctant to listen to the voices of civil society. And we see also a lot of divergence between human rights groups that are much focused on collecting evidence of war crimes and bringing the culpables to justice, rather than building a sustainable peace. It's not always the same. And I think that we need a much more kind of complex approach to that. And I'm not sure that the human rights movement at its present condition is better placed for this. But the civil society in general, I do think it's an issue to be on the agenda, definitely.
Does anyone else want to complement this? Marta?
Yeah, I think this is a really valid question, but I'm not sure that if Helsinki groups are, the self-definition is usually a human rights movement or a human rights civil society movement. I'm not sure that they're today, those that are active are well equipped in terms of expertise, in terms of staff to answer live up to this expectation. After the early 90s, all the capacity building, the funding that came from the US and also European governments, which was crucial, and it brought about a lot of positive things, but it did steer the focus to a certain framework. And it was the Council of Europe, and for those countries which later joined the EU, it was the European Union framework. And there it's very compartmentalized. So the lawyering skills that one learned did not concern security. And security is something that most human rights defenders themselves would find, I think, a very strange term to be featuring on their everyday menu, because it has taken on a meaning, or maybe it has always been a definition, a meaning, where civil society always had to demand space and an involvement, but normally it's not involved. I think this is the general impression. And so while other tools and other methods and frameworks, institutions were effective in remedying problems or remedying individual problems and fixing cracks in a system, this security framework, this security focus, or the broad understanding of security was completely left aside. And now there might be civil society organizations that are focused on this aspect, but they are not the human rights ones, and there is no real connection being made. So it's not only a question of transnational links, but also links within sectors and within different fields of expertise, and discussions being brought up in the EU. I think this is, at the moment, there is some wish to come closer when it comes to, for example, the reasons why there is a shrinking space for civil society. I think a lot of organizations see that this goes much beyond the spectrum of reasons, goes much beyond those that they can address. But certainly this is a very fragmented space still, and it would be important to bring these issues and the people working on them closer together.
Thank you, Marta. And I think what you said about fragmentation is probably really crucial and maybe part of the problem, that we live in that there's too much fragmentation going on, too much specialization, which maybe is the reason why some of the important topics have been fallen off the agenda. And now time is almost up. I would ask you to give each a final statement, maximum 1 minute. What are the most important lessons for you personally from those years? For you personally, but also in what you think for East-West relations today and the future of security cooperation in Europe and cooperation in the field of human rights. Who wants to start? Maybe we start with Professor Biaman now, and then reverse order.
That's very difficult to say. Why? Because the 1989 watershed is similar to the big years of 1945, 1918, 1870, 71, 1815. So these are unique years. And unique years are difficult to compare to the ordinary. And we live in the ordinary, I would say. Although we have our challenges, but not these kinds of watershed events. So what can we take with us? I think what I liked was what Dimitri said, is we can learn from the optimism of the time. And at least in the 70s, it was an optimism against all odds, if you want so. There was not much reason for optimism. But especially human rights movements, they fight against their own mood, if you want so, against being, against resignating, against an almighty state apparatus often. And I think what this year of, I would say, year of surprise can teach us is that things are possible if you believe in them, in national and international politics. and that ideas, like ideas of freedom and of empowerment of people, that they can move politics, and that they can change politics, and that even if things look very desperate at the moment, like in Russia, for example, the reality is not as clear-cut as it seems to be. And there is what I think it was Václav Havel called it the, what do you say, what's the English term? I think the virus of freedom. There is the virus of freedom that is there. And this might inspire people, and there might suddenly come moments where you don't expect them, which suddenly change the fabric of a whole society, of an entire society, and of an entire continent, actually. Even if very few people expect that, it might happen. And so this is, I think, a very strong source of inspiration, I would say. So that's maybe my message.
Dimitri?
Yeah, I very much agree. I also think that this was supposed to be a workshop about a retrospective, about a historical analysis in many ways. And I was reluctant at first, Nadia knows, to join because I'm not a historian. And I also feel that I draw inspiration from that retrospective, but I also feel that the history is happening now and it's kind of slipping beyond under our fingers. And I think there are so many opportunities now that we sometimes fail to see because we focus as human rights activists, as human rights defenders, on reacting, on going against the odds and so on. But I think that the future is inevitably bright for us all, and that's what I would like to believe on. This, as counterintuitive as it sounds, coming from a human rights activist in Russia.
Please, Marta.
These were great comments. So I would say to add to this is that the capacities also have to be there to make use of these opportunities. And so investing in capacities and thinking about what will be needed once or in a few years down the line, these changes or these unexpected events come are the task for today. And it's to get prepared for this and to gain networks and skills and resources that can be used today and in a change of a scenario, I think are extremely important. But this requires a lot of effort, of joint effort, and also support. And this sort of helpful infrastructure has to be put in place. And I think that's also a civil society task.
It's very encouraging that you all ended on such a positive, optimistic note. Yeah, time is definitely up now, and I want to thank you all three of you for the very fruitful exchange and your wonderful statements that really enabled us to make the most of this 1 hour lunch talk. One more time, I want to announce that there will be this follow-up event organized by ZOiS and Friedrich Ebert Foundation in June, and it will set off from the results of today's discussion, take them as a starting point, and in order to look forward into the future, discuss possible future scenarios for European security. And all of this will be done based on the results from a recent study conducted by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Vienna entitled Cooperative Security Initiative. So we will keep you posted on that. And to our Russian-speaking audience, we will try to subtitle the recording of this event in Russian, and in due time we will post it on the ZOiS Facebook page, the Facebook page and our ZOiS website, so you can watch out for that. And now I wish you all a nice afternoon, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the participants coming.